Fort Benning, Georgia, 2015. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade grounds as retired Colonel Frank Iron Townsend stepped out of the black government sedan. At 72, he stood ramrod straight, his weathered face a map of battles fought and memories earned. His dress uniform still fit perfectly, medals glinting in the Georgia sunlight as he adjusted his cover. The invitation had come 3 weeks ago on heavy cardstock with the Army seal embossed in gold. A special request for his attendance at the unveiling of the new XM300 machine gun system for the Abrams tank. Frank had almost declined. These ceremonies were usually more politics than substance, with generals and defense contractors patting each other on the back while pretending to care about the men who would actually use the equipment in combat. But curiosity had gotten the better of him. After all, he had spent 4 decades of his life in and around tanks. Old habits die hard. A young captain approached with a crisp salute. "Colonel Townsend, sir, Captain Miller. I've been assigned as your escort today." Frank returned the salute, noting the captain's combat patches. Iraq and Afghanistan. Good. Not just some headquarters paper pusher. "The ceremony doesn't begin for another hour, sir," Captain Miller continued. "General Parker thought you might enjoy visiting the Armor Museum first." Frank nodded. "Lead the way, Captain." The Tank Museum at Fort Benning housed one of the finest collections of armored vehicles in the world. As they walked through the massive doors, the familiar smell hit Frank immediately. Metal, oil, history, the sense of his life. They moved past a World War II-era Sherman, a Patton, and several other vintage vehicles until they reached the far corner of the main hall. There it stood, an M1 Abrams. Not just any Abrams, but the first production model from 1980. Frank stopped, his breath catching slightly. "This one means something to you, sir?" Captain Miller asked, noticing the change in the older man's demeanor. Frank nodded slowly, reaching out to touch the cold steel of the tank's hull. "Hull number 0013, my first command in the Gulf." The memories rushed back like a flash flood. The heat of the Saudi desert, the constant sand that got into everything. The terrifying night drives using thermal imaging, the thunder of the main gun firing. And his crew, always his crew. "Sir," Captain Miller's voice pulled him back to the present. "They're ready for you in the conference room. Colonel Johnson is eager to meet you." Frank withdrew his hand from the tank, nodded once to the machine as if saying goodbye to an old friend, and followed the captain. They walked through a series of corridors to a modern section of the complex where a sign on the door read, "Advanced Weapons Development Center." Inside, a group of officers and civilians huddled around a table displaying what appeared to be components of a new weapon system. At the head of the table stood a woman in her mid-40s, her colonel's eagles gleaming on her uniform collar. She looked up as Frank entered and immediately approached with an extended hand. "Colonel Townsend, it's an honor, sir. I'm Colonel Miranda Johnson, director of the XM300 program." Frank shook her hand firmly. "Colonel Johnson, thank you for the invitation. Please join us. We were just reviewing the final specs before the demonstration." Frank approached the table, eyes immediately drawn to the disassembled machine gun. His experienced gaze took in the design, the feeding mechanism, the barrel assembly. Sleek, sophisticated, problematic. Colonel Johnson gestured proudly to the weapon. "The XM300 represents the next generation of tank-mounted machine guns. Rate of fire nearly doubles the current M240, with improved accuracy and a 28% weight reduction. The composite materials in the barrel shroud decrease heat signature by 65%. Frank picked up the receiver assembly, turning it over in his hands. Decades of muscle memory guided his fingers as he examined the weapon's construction. "Side ejecting barrel change system," he noted, voice neutral but knowing. "Yes," Johnson smiled, clearly pleased he'd noticed. "Much faster barrel changes in field conditions. Our tests show an average change time of under 15 seconds, compared to nearly 45 with the M240. Frank set the piece down carefully. "In a laboratory, I assume." The room grew quiet. Johnson's smile faltered slightly. "Under various field conditions, sir." Frank nodded, looking directly at her now. "Colonel, this design won't work in a tank." The tension in the room thickened instantly. Johnson's professional composure held, but her eyes hardened. "With all due respect, Colonel Townsend, we've run thousands of hours of testing on this system." "I'm sure you have," Frank replied evenly. "But this side ejection barrel change requires lateral clearance that doesn't exist in the gunner's station of an Abrams. Not if you want to change barrels without exposing the crew or exiting the vehicle. A civilian in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably. Frank had seen enough defense contractors to recognize the type. The man forced a smile and extended his hand. Dr. Alan Roberts, Precision Defense Systems. Colonel, I assure you we've addressed the space constraints extensively. Frank ignored the outstretched hand, instead pointing to the barrel locking mechanism. This design requires at least 8 inches of rightward clearance to extract a hot barrel. Inside a tank, in combat conditions, with a gunner seated and operating under stress, you'd be lucky to have 3. The room had gone completely silent. Johnson exchanged glances with Roberts before turning back to Frank. Colonel, I understand your concerns, but modern engineering solutions have overcome many of the spatial limitations you might remember from your service days. The dismissal in her tone was subtle but clear. Your service days, as if his experience was an outdated relic, like the tanks in the museum outside. Perhaps, Frank conceded, his voice level, you'd be willing to demonstrate a barrel change in the actual gunner's compartment of an Abrams, rather than on this table. Before Johnson could respond, the door opened, and a silver-haired man with 3 stars on his shoulder boards entered. Ah, I see you've all met Colonel Townsend. General Parker, Frank nodded to his old friend. Lieutenant General James Parker, commander of the Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning, clasped Frank's hand warmly. Glad you could make it, Frank. I see you've already started stirring the pot. A thin smile crossed Frank's face. Just asking questions, Jim. Parker turned to the group. Colonel Townsend here probably knows more about tank machine gun systems than anyone alive. If he has concerns, I suggest we listen. Johnson straightened. Of course, General. We welcome Colonel Townsend's input. Perhaps after the demonstration today, we can schedule a more detailed technical review. The diplomatic response wasn't lost on Frank. She was brushing him off, deferring to avoid confrontation. He'd seen it countless times before. The demonstration would be carefully controlled, designed to show only the system's strengths. I'd appreciate that, Frank replied, deciding to play along for now. General Parker checked his watch. It's time we headed to the range. The Secretary of the Army's representative will be arriving shortly. As they filed out of the room, Frank lingered behind, taking one last look at the weapon system on the table. A sense of déjà vu washed over him. He'd seen this mistake before, decades ago, and he knew exactly how it would end. West Germany, 1968. The Cold War. Frank Townsend, then a young first lieutenant, stood in the commander's cupola of his M60 Patton tank, scanning the tree line through binoculars. The autumn air held a sharp bite, and a light drizzle had been falling for hours, turning the German countryside into a muddy mess. Perfect conditions for the training exercise they were conducting near the border with East Germany. Target tank, 2 o'clock. Range 900 meters, Frank called down to his gunner. Identified, came the immediate response from Sergeant Bill Eagle Eye Martinez. The Mexican-American from Arizona had the best eyes in the battalion, able to spot camouflaged targets that others missed completely. Driver, halt, Frank ordered. Halting, acknowledged Sergeant Ray Doc Thompson, bringing the 62-ton machine to a smooth stop. The former combat medic had transferred to armor after Vietnam, claiming he'd seen enough blood for one lifetime. His steady hands made him a natural tank driver. Loading sabot, called Private First Class Johnny Wrench Kowalski as he slammed a training round into the breech. The Detroit native had grown up rebuilding engines with his father, a foreman at the Ford plant. His mechanical intuition was uncanny. Up, Kowalski confirmed. Gunner, fire when ready, Frank commanded. On the way, Martinez replied, squeezing the trigger. The tank shuddered as the blank round fired. In a real engagement, a depleted uranium dart would have streaked toward the target at over a mile per second. In this exercise, a laser registered the hit instead. Target destroyed, reported Private Sam Radio Jackson, monitoring the exercise frequencies. The former college radio DJ had a voice that could cut through any battlefield noise. Frank permitted himself a small smile. His crew was coming together nicely after 3 months of training. They functioned as a single organism, each man anticipating the other's needs and actions. Radio, tell command, we've secured checkpoint Bravo, Frank ordered. As Jackson made the call, Frank noticed something on their right flank. Another M60 from their company had become bogged down in the mud, its tracks spinning uselessly. Driver, turn right. Let's see if Charlie Company needs help. The tank pivoted smoothly and rumbled toward the stranded vehicle. As they approached, Frank could see the commander. Lieutenant Davidson frantically trying to direct his driver out of the mud pit. Frank's tank stopped at a safe distance. Davidson, need a tow. The frustrated lieutenant looked up, relief washing over his face when he recognized Frank. Townsend, thank God, we're stuck good. Track tension's gone to hell too. Hang tight, Frank called. He dropped down into the tank. Wrench, grab the tow cable. Doc, position us for recovery. Within minutes, they had secured the cable between the tanks. With careful coordination and Thompson's expert driving, they slowly pulled Davidson's tank from the mud pit. After the recovery, both crews took a break, sharing cigarettes and coffee from their thermoses. Davidson approached Frank, genuine gratitude in his eyes. Thanks for the save. The colonel would have had my ass if we'd delayed the exercise. Frank waved it off. No problem. That's what we're out here for. Davidson looked troubled. It's not just the mud. Our main gun's elevation system is glitchy, and the cokes jammed 3 times yesterday. The coaxial machine gun was a critical secondary weapon on the tank, mounted alongside the main gun. Frank frowned. What kind of jamming? Feed issues mostly. Gunner tried to clear it, but in the last jam, the barrel change mechanism seized up completely. Let me take a look, Frank offered. Inside Davidson's tank, Frank examined the M73 machine gun mounted beside the main gun. The M73 had been introduced with the M60 tank, but had proven problematic in field conditions. As he inspected the weapon, Frank immediately spotted the issue. Your barrel change latch is binding, he explained, pointing to the mechanism. The mud's gotten into the receiver and hardened around the spring. Davidson looked embarrassed. We cleaned it last night. Not thoroughly enough, Frank replied, not unkindly. These M73s need obsessive maintenance, especially in these conditions. Using his pocket knife and a cleaning rod, Frank carefully cleared the hardened mud from the mechanism. He then applied a thin coat of lubricant from his personal kit rather than the standard issue oil. Try this, he handed the weapon back to Davidson's gunner. The standard CLP gets too thick in this cold. This stuff will work better. The gunner cycled the action, eyes widening at the smooth operation. That's much better, sir. Thank you. Just make sure you clean it properly tonight. Complete disassembly, not just a field strip. As they prepared to resume the exercise, Major Williams, the battalion executive officer, arrived in a jeep. He approached Frank with purpose in his stride. Lieutenant Townsend, a word. Frank followed the major a short distance from the tanks. I just got a call from Regiment, Williams began without preamble. They want you at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Orders are being cut now. Frank was stunned. Aberdeen? Sir, we're in the middle of pre-deployment training. My crew, Williams cut him off. Not my call, Lieutenant. Apparently, General Hamilton specifically requested you. Hamilton? The Wallace Hamilton? Frank couldn't hide his surprise. General Wallace Hamilton was a legend in the armor branch. A tank commander in World War II who had fought at the Battle of the Bulge, he now oversaw weapons development at Aberdeen. The same, all I know is you're to report to Aberdeen in 72 hours. Captain Morris will take over your platoon. Frank's mind raced. May I ask why, sir? Williams shrugged. Above my pay grade, but Scuttlebutt says they're having issues with the new tank machine gun trials. The M85, apparently your name came up. Frank remembered filing a detailed report 6 months earlier about the M73's shortcomings, along with some suggested modifications. He never expected anyone above company level to actually read it. Sir, with respect, I'd rather stay with my platoon. We're deploying in less than 2 months. The major's expression softened slightly. I understand, Frank, but these orders come straight from the top. Sometimes the Army needs your brain more than your trigger finger. That evening, Frank sat alone in the barracks writing a letter to his crew. How did you tell men you trained with, bonded with, that you were abandoning them before deployment? The words wouldn't come. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His crew stood there, awkwardly holding a bottle of whiskey. Heard you're leaving us for the brass hats, LT, Thompson said. No accusation in his voice, just acceptance. Frank gestured them in. Not my choice, Doc. They filed in, Kowalski producing 5 tin cups from his pocket. Jackson poured a measure of whiskey into each. To Lieutenant Townsend, Martinez raised his cup. The best damn tank commander in the battalion. Frank felt his throat tighten. To the best crew a commander could ask for. I'm sorry I won't be with you over there. Just make sure whatever fancy new gun they're cooking up actually works, Thompson said. So the next poor bastards don't have to deal with what we've got now. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and fears, cementing a bond that transcended their short time together. By morning, Frank had made peace with his new orders. If he couldn't protect his men directly, Perhaps he could do it by ensuring they had equipment worthy of their courage. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, 3 days later. Frank stepped off the military transport flight into a cold rain. A corporal met him at the airfield with a jeep and drove him directly to the Tank Automotive Test Facility. The massive complex housed everything from engine test cells to firing ranges to environmental chambers that could simulate any battlefield condition on Earth. At the main administration building, Frank was directed to a conference room where several officers and civilians were engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. The room fell silent as he entered. A tall, white-haired man with general stars rose to greet him. Despite being in his 60s, General Wallace Hamilton exuded the unmistakable aura of command. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct and evaluating. "Lieutenant Townsend, thank you for coming on such short notice." "My pleasure, sir," Frank replied, though pleasure had little to do with it. Hamilton introduced the others. Colonel James Whitfield, the project manager, Dr. Philip Westmore, chief engineer from the contractor, and several other technical specialists. Frank noted the tension in the room, the tight expressions and defensive postures. "Lieutenant, I read your report on the M73 machine gun with great interest," Hamilton began. "Your practical observations matched our test data, but you proposed solutions no one here had considered." Frank glanced at Westmore, who made no effort to hide his skepticism. "Thank you, sir," Frank replied cautiously. "We're having issues with the M85 program," Hamilton continued. "On paper, it's superior to the M73 in every way. Higher rate of fire, improved accuracy, better durability. But in field testing, it's failing," Frank finished, seeing the admission in their faces. Hamilton nodded. "Catastrophically in some cases, yet our laboratory tests show excellent performance." "The disconnect is often between theory and combat reality, sir," Frank offered. Westmore bristled visibly. "Our tests are designed to simulate all battlefield conditions, Lieutenant. The failures we're experiencing are anomalous." Frank met the engineer's gaze steadily. "With respect to Westmore, there's a difference between simulated conditions and having rounds incoming while you're trying to clear a jam in a moving vehicle." Hamilton's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Precisely why you're here, Lieutenant. I want you to join the test program. Bring your field experience to bear. Help us understand where the disconnect is occurring." Frank was taken aback. "Sir, I'm a line officer, not a test engineer." "You're exactly what we need," Hamilton insisted. "Someone who understands both the technology and the men who will use it." Colonel Whitfield spoke up for the first time. "This isn't a permanent reassignment, Lieutenant. 3 months at most. Then you can rejoin your unit." 3 months. Frank did the math quickly. His platoon would be halfway through their deployment by then. The men he'd trained would be led by someone else in combat. Hamilton seemed to read his thoughts. "I know this takes you away from your command at a critical time, but consider the broader impact. If we field a flawed weapon system, how many crews might pay the price?" Put that way, Frank had little choice. "I understand, sir. I'll do what I can." "Excellent. Dr. Westmore will brief you on the technical specifications. Tomorrow you'll observe the first series of field tests." As the meeting broke up, Westmore approached Frank with barely concealed disdain. "Lieutenant, while we appreciate your practical perspective, please understand that this is a highly sophisticated weapon system designed by the finest minds in military engineering." The condescension was palpable. Frank had encountered this attitude before from technical experts who viewed soldiers as mere users rather than partners in development. "I look forward to learning from your expertise, Doctor," Frank replied diplomatically. Westmore nodded curtly and handed him a thick binder. "The technical specifications. I suggest you review them before tomorrow's demonstration." After Westmore left, Colonel Whitfield approached. Unlike the engineer, his manner was respectful. "Don't mind Westmore. He's brilliant but has never been shot at." Frank appreciated the colonel's candor. "Sir, can I ask why General Hamilton specifically requested me? My report wasn't that groundbreaking." Whitfield considered the question. "Hamilton commanded tanks in the Battle of the Bulge, lost half his company to mechanical failures before they ever engaged the enemy. He's never forgotten that the best technology is worthless if it doesn't work when bullets are flying." That evening, Frank sat alone in his temporary quarters, poring over the technical specifications of the M85 machine gun. The weapon was indeed impressive on paper. Gas-operated, air-cooled, capable of firing up to 1,000 rounds per minute. The barrel change system was particularly innovative, allowing for rapid replacement when the barrel overheated during sustained fire. But as Frank studied the design, his concerns grew. The side ejection barrel change system required the operator to open a latch on the right side of the weapon, slide the barrel out laterally, insert a new one, then close the latch. In open air, on a test range, this would work fine. But inside the confining space of a tank turret, with ammunition boxes, fire control systems, and other equipment restricting movement, Frank sketched the interior layout of an M60's turret from memory, then overlaid the barrel change motion required by the M85. The conflict was immediately obvious. A gunner would need to contort his body unnaturally to execute the change, assuming it was possible at all without partially exiting the protected space of the turret. The next morning, Frank arrived at the test range where several M60 tanks were positioned. Technicians swarmed around the vehicles, attaching sensors and calibrating equipment. Dr. Westmore was directing the activity like a conductor, checking details and issuing corrections. "Lieutenant," he acknowledged Frank with minimal courtesy, "we're demonstrating the M85's performance characteristics today. Accuracy, rate of fire, barrel longevity, and the barrel change procedure." Frank nodded. "Will we be testing inside an actual tank configuration?" Westmore's expression tightened. "That's scheduled for next week. Today's tests focus on the baseline performance metrics." As Frank had expected, the demonstration was carefully controlled. The M85 was mounted on a fixed stand with ample space around it. A technician fired several bursts at targets downrange, demonstrating impressive accuracy. When the barrel needed changing, he executed the procedure smoothly, with no obstructions to hinder the side ejection. Frank watched silently, making notes. When the initial demonstration concluded, Westmore approached him with a satisfied expression. "As you can see, Lieutenant, the M85 represents a quantum leap forward in design and performance." "Very impressive," Frank agreed, "but not representative of how it will be used in combat." Westmore's smile faltered. "These are baseline metrics. As I mentioned, vehicle integration tests begin next week." "I'd like to see the barrel change performed inside a tank turret today," Frank pressed. "By a regular tank gunner, not a technician familiar with the prototype." Colonel Whitfield, who had been observing nearby, joined the conversation. "That's not an unreasonable request, Doctor. We have tanks and crews here. Let's see how your system performs in its intended environment." Westmore clearly wanted to refuse but couldn't without appearing defensive. "Very well, but I must note that the gunners haven't been properly trained on the new system." "That's exactly the point," Frank replied. "In combat, crews often have to operate with minimal training on new equipment. The system should be intuitive enough for a qualified gunner to use effectively after basic instruction." An hour later, a staff sergeant from the test battalion sat in the gunner's position of an M60 with the M85 mounted in the coaxial position. Westmore had given him a 15-minute briefing on the weapon's operation, focusing particularly on the barrel change procedure. Frank climbed into the commander's position above the gunner. The familiar confines of the turret brought back memories, both good and bad. The smell of menthol and hydraulic fluid, the cramped quarters that became home during long operations. "Commence firing," Whitfield ordered from outside the tank. The gunner triggered several bursts from the M85, which performed flawlessly. The rate of fire was impressive, the accuracy excellent. But Frank was waiting for what would come next. "Barrel change," Whitfield commanded. The gunner reached for the barrel change latch on the right side of the weapon. Immediately, the problem became apparent. The latch was partially obstructed by the main gun breech mechanism. The gunner had to contort his arm at an awkward angle just to release it. "Sir, I can't get proper leverage," the gunner reported, frustration evident in his voice. "Continue trying, Sergeant," Westmore called from outside. The gunner struggled with the latch, finally managing to release it. But when he tried to slide the barrel out to the right, as designed, he encountered another obstacle. The side wall of the turret prevented the barrel from clearing the weapon. "Sir, there's not enough clearance," the gunner reported. Frank wasn't surprised. He'd seen this exact issue in his mental modeling the night before. "Perhaps if you adjust your position," Westmore suggested, his voice tight. The gunner tried several different angles, contorting himself uncomfortably in the confined space. After nearly 2 minutes of struggling, he managed to extract the barrel partially, but couldn't remove it completely without risking burns from the hot metal. "I can't do it safely, sir," the gunner finally admitted. Frank exchanged glances with the man, seeing the frustration and embarrassment in his eyes. It wasn't the gunner's fault the design was flawed. "End exercise," Whitfield called. Outside the tank, Westmore was already preparing his defense. "The gunner clearly needs more training, And this is just a prototype mounting. The production integration will resolve these space issues. Frank shook his head. The fundamental problem is the side ejection design, Doctor. It's incompatible with the confined space of a tank turret. No amount of training or minor modifications will change that basic reality. Westmore's face reddened. Lieutenant, you've been here less than 24 hours. Our team has been developing this system for 3 years. I think we understand the engineering challenges better than you do. Engineering isn't the issue, Frank countered calmly. It's practical application in combat conditions. A barrel change that takes minutes instead of seconds can get a tank crew killed. Colonel Whitfield raised his hands to diffuse the tension. Gentlemen, this is why we test. Lieutenant Townsend has raised valid concerns that need to be addressed. Dr. Westmore, your team should consider modifications to the barrel change system for the tank-mounted version. Westmore was clearly unhappy but nodded stiffly. We'll review the data and consider alternatives. As they walked back to the administration building, Whitfield spoke quietly to Frank. You've made an enemy today, Lieutenant. Westmore has a lot of influence with the procurement committee. Frank shrugged. I'm not here to make friends, sir, just to make sure we don't send men into combat with equipment that will fail them when it matters most. Whitfield studied him thoughtfully. Hamilton was right about you. You care more about the men than the machinery. The best technology in the world is worthless if a 19-year-old gunner can't use it effectively while being shot at, sir. Precisely. The colonel smiled. Report to my office tomorrow morning. I think it's time we expanded your role in this project. That night, unable to sleep, Frank wandered the nearly deserted facility. His mind kept returning to the M85's flawed design. There was something familiar about the problem, something that nagged at the edges of his consciousness. Finding himself near the technical library, he decided to see if inspiration might be found among the stacks of reports and manuals. The elderly librarian, surprised to see anyone at that hour, nevertheless helped him navigate the collection. I'm looking for information on machine gun designs, specifically those used in armored vehicles, Frank explained. Any particular era or country? The librarian asked. Frank was about to say contemporary American designs when a thought struck him. Actually, German designs from World War II, the MG34 and MG42 if you have anything on them. The librarian raised an eyebrow, but led him to a section containing captured German technical documents that had been translated after the war. These haven't been requested in years, he commented. Most of the weapons development people focus on current systems. Frank thanked him and began sifting through the materials. Hours passed as he absorbed the details of the German machine gun development program. The MG34 had been the world's first general-purpose machine gun, revolutionary for its time. The MG42, developed later, was simpler, more rugged, and had a higher rate of fire. What caught Frank's attention, however, was a technical note about tank-mounted variations. The Germans had continued to use the MG34 in tanks even after the superior MG42 was widely adopted by infantry units. The reason? The MG42's side-ejecting barrel change system made it incompatible with the confined space of tank turrets, while the MG34's rotating barrel change could be operated within the limited space. Frank sat back, stunned by the parallel. The Germans had encountered and solved this exact problem 25 years earlier, yet here was the American weapons development community making the same mistake. History was repeating itself because no one had bothered to study it. As dawn broke, Frank was still in the library when a young lieutenant entered, looking surprised to find someone there. Sorry to disturb you, sir, the officer said. I'm Lieutenant Jack Sullivan, Intelligence Liaison. I sometimes use the library when it's quiet. Frank introduced himself, curious about the intelligence officer's presence. Intelligence Liaison to a weapons development program? Sullivan smiled. I evaluate captured Soviet equipment, looking for design elements we might counter or adapt. Know your enemy, as they say. An idea formed in Frank's mind. Lieutenant, how familiar are you with World War II German machine gun designs? Sullivan's eyes lit up. Very familiar, sir. It was the focus of my master's thesis at West Point. The MG42 revolutionized machine gun design. Its influence can still be seen in modern systems. Frank gestured to the documents spread before him. Then perhaps you can help me understand something. Why did the Germans keep using the MG34 in tanks even after developing the MG42? Sullivan didn't hesitate. Barrel change compatibility, sir. The MG42's side ejection system required lateral clearance that wasn't available in tank turrets. The MG34's rotating system worked better in confined spaces, even though it was slower and more complex. Frank nodded, his suspicions confirmed. And did the Germans ever solve this problem? Did they develop a tank-specific variant of the MG-42? They did, actually, Sullivan replied, his voice animated with scholarly enthusiasm. Late in the war, they were developing a tank-specific MG-42 variant with a modified barrel change system, but it never entered full production before Germany surrendered. I have some documentation on the prototype if you are interested. Frank felt a surge of excitement. Very interested, Lieutenant. I think you and I have a lot to talk about. As the morning sun streamed through the library windows, two officers from different worlds bent over yellowed technical documents, discovering that the answers to present challenges had been written decades before, in the harsh lessons of another war. Frank knew he had found not only a solution to the M85's problems, but also a powerful ally in making his case. The path forward was becoming clear. Now he just had to convince the Army to listen to the voices of the past before committing the same errors in the present. And in doing so, perhaps save the lives of tank crews not yet born, fighting in wars not yet imagined. It would be a battle unlike any he'd trained for, fought not with shells and armor, but with knowledge and persistence against the twin enemies of pride and institutional inertia. But it was a battle worth fighting. For his former crew, for all the young men who would someday depend on these weapons in moments of desperate need. Frank Townsend straightened his shoulders, ready for a different kind of combat. "Let's get to work, Lieutenant Sullivan," he said. "We've got history to uncover and futures to save." The morning briefing room at Aberdeen Proving Ground hummed with anticipation. Frank Townsend stood near the back wall, watching as Dr. Philip Westmore confidently addressed the assembled officers and defense contractors. A large screen behind him displayed impressive test footage of the M85 machine gun firing with remarkable precision. "As you can see, gentlemen," Westmore gestured to the slow-motion sequence of the weapon cycling, "the M85 represents a 30% improvement in cyclic rate over the M73, with a 42% reduction in dispersion at range." The assembled officials nodded appreciatively. The numbers were impressive, Frank had to admit. On paper and in controlled demonstrations, the M85 was indeed a superior weapon. But combat wasn't fought on paper. "We've conducted over 2,000 hours of reliability testing," Westmore continued, advancing to the next slide showing a pristine M85 mounted on a laboratory test stand. Mean rounds between failure exceed 12,000, compared to just 3,000 for the M73 currently in service. Colonel Whitfield, sitting in the front row, turned slightly toward Frank with a questioning look. Frank gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The testing data was accurate but irrelevant. Laboratory conditions bore little resemblance to the brutal realities of battlefield use. After the presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, Whitfield approached Frank. "You don't look convinced, Lieutenant." "The data's not wrong, sir. It's just incomplete." Whitfield nodded thoughtfully. "Walk with me." They exited the briefing room and headed toward the test ranges. The April morning was cool but pleasant, with spring finally asserting itself over the Maryland landscape. "General Hamilton is pushing for a more comprehensive testing protocol," Whitfield explained as they walked. "Something that better reflects actual combat conditions. He wants you to design it." Frank stopped, surprised. "Me, sir, Dr. Westmore has an entire team of test engineers." "Who've never been in combat?" Whitfield replied. "The general wants tests that reflect what tank crews actually experience, not theoretical worst-case scenarios devised by engineers who've never left Maryland." "Westmore won't like that." "Westmore doesn't have to like it. This comes directly from Hamilton. You'll have full authority to design and oversee the testing protocol." Whitfield hesitated before adding, "I should warn you, though, there's significant pressure from above to move the M85 into production quickly. The Defense Appropriations Subcommittee is eager to see results from their investment." "Politics," Frank thought. "Always politics." "Understood, sir. When do I start?" "Immediately. You'll have a team assigned by end of day. I suggest you work with Lieutenant Sullivan. His historical perspective might be valuable." Frank spent the rest of the morning drafting a comprehensive testing protocol that would subject the M85 to conditions tank crews actually faced in combat: extreme dust, mud, rain, extended firing without maintenance, operation by fatigued personnel, barrel changes in confined spaces. By lunchtime, he had the outline of a program that would truly test the weapon's combat worthiness. As he reviewed his notes in the base cafeteria, Lieutenant Sullivan joined him, carrying a stack of folders. "Those German documents you asked for, sir," Sullivan said, placing them on the table. including everything we have on the late war experimental tank version of the MG-42. Excellent, Frank replied. Pull up a chair, Lieutenant. I've been tasked with designing a realistic testing protocol for the M85. I'd value your input. Sullivan's eyes widened slightly. Really, sir? I'm just an intelligence officer with specialized knowledge relevant to our problem. Sometimes the best insights come from outside the usual channels. They spent the next hour reviewing Frank's draft protocol, with Sullivan offering historical context from German testing procedures. The Germans encountered similar issues with the original MG-42 prototypes, Sullivan explained, pointing to a translated test report. When they tested in laboratory conditions, the weapon performed flawlessly, but field testing in Russia revealed serious problems with dust and extreme cold. Frank nodded. Exactly the kind of real-world factors we need to account for. What solution did they implement? They simplified the design further and increased the tolerances between moving parts, Sullivan replied. Made it less precise but more reliable under adverse conditions. The opposite of what Dr. Westmore seems to be doing with the M85. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, one of the engineers from Westmore's team. A serious woman in her early 40s, she approached their table with determined strides. Lieutenant Townsend, I've been assigned to your testing team. Dr. Westmore asked me to get details on your requirements. Her tone made it clear this assignment wasn't her choice. Frank gestured to an empty chair. Dr. Mitchell, please join us. This is Lieutenant Sullivan, Intelligence Liaison. We were just discussing realistic testing parameters. Mitchell sat stiffly, pulling out a notepad. I should inform you that we've already conducted extensive testing under a variety of conditions. I'm sure you have, Frank replied evenly. But I'm specifically interested in conditions that replicate combat experiences. For instance, how does the M85 perform after being submerged in muddy water, then operated immediately without cleaning? Mitchell frowned. That would violate standard operating procedures for weapon maintenance. Frank exchanged glances with Sullivan. In an ideal world, Doctor, every weapon would be perfectly maintained at all times. In combat, tanks often ford streams or muddy terrain, then immediately engage the enemy. The crew doesn't have time for textbook maintenance procedures. I see. Mitchell made a note, her expression skeptical. What other realistic scenarios did you have in mind? By the end of their meeting, Mitchell had filled several pages with test parameters that clearly concerned her. As she prepared to leave, Frank noticed her lingering, seemingly wanting to say something more. Was there something else, Doctor? She hesitated, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. These tests you're proposing, Dr. Westmore won't be pleased. He's invested a lot in the current design approach. My concern isn't Dr. Westmore's feelings, but whether the weapon will function when American lives depend on it. Something shifted in Mitchell's expression. Of course, I'll have the test facilities prepared according to your specifications. After she left, Sullivan leaned forward. She seems more reasonable than Westmore. She's an engineer, not a politician, Frank replied. Engineers ultimately care about whether things work. It's the managers who care about budgets and timelines. Speaking of politics, Sullivan said carefully, I heard some scuttlebutt you should know about. Senator William Hayes is taking a personal interest in the M85 program. Frank raised an eyebrow. A senator concerned with a specific weapons system? That's unusual. Not when the primary contractor is headquartered in his state, Sullivan replied. Precision Defense Systems employs over 2,000 people in Hayes' district. He sits on the Defense Appropriations Committee. The picture was becoming clearer. So there's political pressure to approve the system regardless of its combat readiness. Exactly, and Dr. Westmore previously worked directly for Senator Hayes as a technical advisor before joining PDS. Frank absorbed this information silently. The challenge before him was growing more complex. This wasn't just a technical problem, but a political one as well. Lives versus livelihoods. Military necessity versus economic reality. Thank you for the intelligence, Lieutenant. Keep your ear to the ground. The next morning, Frank presented his testing protocol to Colonel Whitfield and General Hamilton. The detailed plan would subject the M85 to a grueling series of trials designed to replicate the worst conditions tank crews might face in combat. Hamilton reviewed the document thoughtfully. This is exactly what I wanted, Lieutenant. No punches pulled. Sir, I should note that Dr. Westmore will likely object to several of these procedures, Frank cautioned. They fall outside of the parameters of the original test plan. Let him object, Hamilton replied firmly. I've been fighting this battle since Korea. Every new weapon system comes with promises of revolutionary performance, but when the shooting starts, it's reliability that keeps soldiers alive. Whitfield looked concerned. General Senator Hayes called the Pentagon twice this week, asking about the M85's progress. There's significant political interest in this program. Hamilton's expression hardened. Politics be damned, Colonel. I won't approve a weapon system that will fail our tank crews when they need it most. He turned to Frank. Proceed with testing immediately. Full documentation of all results. I want to see everything, especially the failures. The testing began the following day at a remote section of the Aberdeen facility. Frank had assembled a team including regular tank gunners from the test battalion, technical experts, and Dr. Mitchell representing the design team. Notably absent was Dr. Westmore himself, who had sent word he was unavoidably detained in Washington. The first series of tests were basic function checks under ideal conditions. As expected, the M85 performed admirably, matching or exceeding the performance data from Westmore's presentations. Frank ensured these results were meticulously documented, establishing a baseline for comparison. On the second day, they began the environmental testing. The M85 was subjected to dust conditions, with fine particulate blown over the weapon during operation. Within 300 rounds, the first malfunctions appeared. The precisely machined bolt assembly, with its tight tolerances, began to bind as dust accumulated in the receiver. Stoppage, failure to extract, reported the gunner, a staff sergeant with 2 tours in Vietnam. Frank noted the failure in the log. Clear the weapon and continue firing. The gunner attempted to clear the jam, but struggled with the tightly bound mechanism. Sir, the extractor is completely seized. Dr. Mitchell observed with growing concern. This level of dust exposure is extreme. No weapon system would be expected to function in these conditions without maintenance. Sergeant, Frank asked, during your tours in Vietnam, did you ever experience dust conditions like this? Yes, sir, the sergeant replied without hesitation. Especially during the dry season. Dust so thick you could write your name on your weapon after a single patrol. Frank turned to Mitchell. And that's just Vietnam. Imagine desert conditions in the Middle East. Mitchell made notes but offered no further objections. The testing continued over the next several days, with each scenario more demanding than the last. The M85 was subjected to mud, water immersion, extreme temperatures, and sustained fire trials. With each test, more weaknesses in the design became apparent. Most critically, the barrel change procedure remained problematic in the confined space of a tank turret, taking 4 times longer than the M73 it was meant to replace. On the 5th day, Colonel Whitfield arrived with an unexpected visitor, General Hamilton himself. The general observed silently as the team demonstrated the barrel change procedure inside an actual M60 tank turret. After 3 minutes of struggling, the gunner finally managed to extract the overheated barrel and replace it with a fresh one. 3 minutes, Hamilton noted grimly. In combat, that tank would be burning wreckage before the gunner finished. Dr. Mitchell, who had grown increasingly quiet as the testing progressed, finally spoke up. General, these results are concerning. The performance in controlled conditions doesn't translate to these battlefield scenarios. That's precisely what Lieutenant Townsend warned would happen, Hamilton replied. The question is, can the design be modified to address these issues? Before Mitchell could respond, a staff car pulled up to the test area. Dr. Westmore emerged, followed by a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, Remington suit, whom Frank didn't recognize. Westmore's face was flushed with barely controlled anger as he approached the group. General Hamilton, I understand you've authorized an unauthorized testing protocol for my weapon system. Hamilton's expression didn't change. Your weapon system, Doctor? Last I checked, the United States Army was paying for its development. The man in the suit stepped forward smoothly. General, I'm Richard Daniels, Executive Vice President at Precision Defense Systems. We're concerned that these unconventional tests might give an inaccurate impression of the M85's capabilities. On the contrary, Hamilton replied, they give a very accurate impression of how the weapon will perform under actual combat conditions. Westmore glared at Frank. This is your doing, Lieutenant. These arbitrary trials are designed to make the M85 fail. Frank met his gaze steadily. No, Doctor. They're designed to ensure it won't fail when American lives depend on it. Daniels intervened again, his tone conciliatory but firm. General PDS has invested millions in the M85 program based on the approved test protocols. These additional tests were never part of our development agreement. They are now, Hamilton stated flatly. Lieutenant Townsend has identified critical flaws in the design that must be addressed before the system can be approved for field use. Westmore looked as though he might explode. What exactly are these alleged flaws? Frank stepped forward. Primary among them is the barrel change system. The side ejection design is incompatible with the confined space of a tank turret. In our tests, barrel changes took an average of 2 minutes, 57 seconds. The current M73, for all its faults, can be changed in under 40 seconds. That's a training issue, Westmore dismissed. No, it's a fundamental design flaw, Frank countered. One the Germans identified and solved during World War II with their tank machine guns. This caught Westmore off guard. The Germans? What relevance do Nazi weapon systems have to modern American design? Lieutenant Sullivan, who had been observing quietly, spoke up. Significant relevance, Doctor. The Germans faced the exact same problem with their MG42, which used a similar side ejection barrel change system to your M85. They determined it was unsuitable for tank use and continued using the MG34 with its rotating barrel change in armored vehicles. Daniels looked increasingly uncomfortable. General, this is absurd. Comparing our advanced system to Nazi equipment from 40 years ago? Physics and ergonomics haven't changed, Mr. Daniels, Hamilton replied. Lieutenant Townsend and Lieutenant Sullivan have identified a legitimate design issue that must be addressed. Westmore's face had turned from red to white. This is clearly a coordinated attempt to undermine the M85 program. Senator Hayes will hear about this obstruction. Is that a threat, Doctor? Hamilton asked quietly. Daniels quickly intervened. Not at all, General. Dr. Westmore is simply expressing his frustration. We've worked closely with the Senator on job creation in the defense sector. I'm more concerned with keeping soldiers alive than creating jobs, Hamilton replied. Though I recognize both are important, the M85 will not be approved for production until these design issues are resolved. That's final. As the confrontation ended, Westmore stormed off with Daniels following, already on his phone. Frank suspected Senator Hayes would indeed hear about the day's events within the hour. Colonel Whitfield sighed heavily. That could have gone better. On the contrary, Hamilton said, it went exactly as it needed to. They know we won't be railroaded into accepting a flawed design. He turned to Frank. Good work, Lieutenant. Continue the testing. Document everything meticulously. We're going to need every bit of evidence when the political pressure comes. After Hamilton and Whitfield departed, Dr. Mitchell approached Frank. Her expression was troubled, but resolute. Lieutenant, there's something you should know. Some of the early test failures, Dr. Westmore ordered them removed from the official record. Frank wasn't entirely surprised. Can you prove that? I kept copies of the original test data, she replied quietly. I didn't agree with altering the results, but you were following orders, Frank finished for her. I understand. Would you be willing to share that data with me unofficially? Mitchell hesitated only briefly. This is about getting the design right, isn't it? Not about careers or contracts. Exactly. It's about the 19-year-old gunner who will depend on this weapon in combat. She nodded firmly. I'll get you the files tonight. That evening, Frank and Sullivan reviewed the suppressed test data in Sullivan's small office. The documents revealed that the M85 had experienced significant reliability issues from the earliest prototypes, particularly in adverse conditions. Westmore had systematically removed these failures from the official reports, presenting a sanitized version to the Army evaluation team. This is worse than I thought, Frank said, reviewing the failure rates. The basic design concept is flawed, not just the implementation. Sullivan nodded grimly. The similarities to the German experience are striking. They eventually realized that a tank machine gun requires different design priorities than an infantry weapon. The question is, what do we do with this information, Frank mused. If we present it officially, Mitchell's career is over. Westmore will know immediately where it came from. And if we don't, a fundamentally flawed weapon system might be approved for political reasons. Frank stared at the data, weighing his options. His thoughts drifted to his old crew, now deployed without him. What would Thompson say? Probably something profane but wise about choosing between bad options. What would his gunner, Martinez, want in his tank? A weapon that worked when it mattered, regardless of politics. We use the information to design an alternative, Frank decided. We don't expose Mitchell, but we use what we've learned to develop a better solution. Sullivan looked surprised. Design our own machine gun? That's a bit beyond our mandate, isn't it? Not a completely new design, Frank clarified. A modified M73 that addresses its known flaws while maintaining its strengths, particularly the rotating barrel change system that works in confined spaces. You're talking about a skunkworks project, Sullivan said, excitement creeping into his voice. Off the books development. Exactly. Mitchell has the technical expertise. You have the historical knowledge. I have the combat experience. Together, we might be able to create a viable alternative before the M85 is forced through on political pressure. The next day, Frank approached Mitchell cautiously, outlining his idea while being careful not to put her career at further risk. To his surprise, she didn't hesitate. I've been having doubts about the M85 design for months, she admitted. The theoretical advantages are impressive, but the practical limitations keep getting dismissed. I'd welcome the chance to work on a more realistic alternative. It would have to be unofficial, at least initially, Frank cautioned. Westmore can't know. I understand. I can access the design facilities after hours. No one monitors the machine shop closely. With Mitchell's agreement, the small team began their clandestine project. Using an M73 as their starting point, they identified its key weaknesses: the feed system that tended to jam, the complex barrel change mechanism that, while suitable for tank use, was overly complicated and prone to failure. Sullivan contributed historical insights from German designs, particularly the late war experiments with adapting the MG42 for tank use while preserving the rotating barrel change concept. The Germans never completed the development, he explained one evening, as they worked in a disused storage building Mitchell had repurposed as their workshop. But their prototype showed promise. They essentially created a hybrid that combined the MG42's simplified internal mechanisms with the MG34's rotating barrel change. Frank, who had been disassembling an M73 receiver, looked up with interest. That's essentially what we're trying to do: simplify the M73's internals while preserving its tank compatibility. Mitchell examined the German technical drawings Sullivan had brought. The feed system is particularly elegant, much more reliable than our current design. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked nights and weekends on their unofficial project, which they had dubbed the M73E for Enhanced. Frank contributed practical insights from his combat experience, while Mitchell applied her engineering expertise to translate concepts into functional designs. Sullivan continued to unearth relevant historical examples and served as their lookout, ensuring their clandestine work remained undiscovered. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Frank had been struggling with the barrel locking mechanism, trying to simplify it while maintaining safety, when Mitchell suggested incorporating a principle from an entirely different field. In aircraft landing gear, we use a similar locking problem, she explained, sketching rapidly. The gear has to be absolutely secure when deployed, but also easily retracted when needed. What if we applied that principle here? Her innovation solved the problem elegantly, creating a barrel locking mechanism that was both secure and easily operated in confined spaces. With this key advancement, the other elements of the M73E began falling into place. Meanwhile, the official testing of the M85 continued, with each new trial revealing additional flaws in the design. Westmore became increasingly defensive and hostile, openly accusing Frank of sabotaging the tests to advance his own agenda. The political pressure also intensified. General Hamilton was summoned to Washington twice to explain the testing delays to concerned congressional committees. Senator Hayes made no secret of his displeasure, openly questioning whether certain elements in the Army testing establishment were deliberately obstructing progress. Colonel Whitfield pulled Frank aside after a particularly difficult day of testing. "Things are getting hot, Lieutenant. The Senator is pushing hard for conditional approval of the M85. "Conditional approval would be a death sentence for tank crews, sirs," Frank replied. "The fundamental design flaws remain unaddressed." Whitfield nodded grimly. "Hamilton is holding the line for now, but he can only resist the political pressure for so long. Unless we have an alternative to offer, the M85 will eventually be approved regardless of its flaws." Frank hesitated, then made a decision. "Sir, there might be an alternative. Unofficially, we've been working on a modified M73 that addresses its known shortcomings while maintaining its suitability for tank use." Whitfield's eyebrows shot up. "We? Who's involved in this unofficial project?" "Myself, Lieutenant Sullivan, and others with technical expertise. It's a skunkworks effort, sir, off the books." The colonel considered this information carefully. "Does it show promise?" "Yes, sir. We've solved the major reliability issues while maintaining the rotating barrel change system that works in confined spaces. It's not as theoretically impressive as the M85 in terms of rate of fire, but it will function consistently under combat conditions. How close are you to a functioning prototype? Days, sir, maybe a week at most. Whitfield was silent for a long moment. I don't know anything about this conversation, Lieutenant, but if a viable alternative were to suddenly appear, it might provide General Hamilton with the ammunition he needs to definitively reject the M85. Frank understood. The colonel was giving tacit approval without official knowledge, providing deniability while supporting their efforts. Understood, sir. One more thing, Lieutenant. Watch your back. Westmore is desperate and has powerful allies. There have been suggestions that your continued opposition might affect your military career. Frank had expected as much. Thank you for the warning, sir, but I didn't take this assignment to advance my career. No, Whitfield agreed with a slight smile. You took it to protect your men. Keep that principle in mind, and you won't go wrong. That evening, as their small team worked on final adjustments to the M73E prototype, Sullivan burst into the workshop, his expression tense. We have a problem. Westmore was asking questions about our after-hours activities. Someone's noticed the lights on in this building. Mitchell looked alarmed. If he discovers what we're doing, we accelerate the timeline, Frank decided. How close are we to a functioning prototype? The mechanical elements are complete, Mitchell replied. We still need to conduct firing tests, but the basic system is operational. Then we test tomorrow night, Frank declared. If it works, we present it to Hamilton immediately before Westmore can interfere. Sullivan looked concerned. That's risky. We haven't run any of the standard safety protocols. We don't have time for standard protocols, Frank replied. Westmore is pushing for conditional approval of the M85. Once that happens, our window closes. Mitchell nodded resolutely. I'll prepare the prototype for firing tests. We can use the remote range after hours. The security guards owe me a favor. As they finalized their preparations, Frank felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Their unauthorized project could end all their careers if it went wrong, but the alternative was accepting a weapon system that would fail when soldiers needed it most. His thoughts returned to his old crew, particularly Thompson, the former medic who had seen enough death and had transferred to armorman, hoping to save lives rather than patch wounds. What would Thompson think of this gamble? Frank could almost hear his gravelly voice. Sometimes you gotta break rules to save lives, LT. The next evening they assembled at the remote test range. Mitchell had transported the M73E prototype in sections, concealed in ordinary equipment cases. As they assembled the weapon on the test stand, Frank felt a strange mix of apprehension and excitement. Final checks, Mitchell announced, running through a pre-flight list she had adapted from her aircraft engineering days. Sullivan kept watch at the perimeter, alert for any unexpected visitors. All clear so far. Frank loaded a belt of blank ammunition into the feed tray. They would start with blanks to test the cycling before moving to live rounds. Ready when you are, Doctor. Mitchell completed her checks and nodded. System is nominal. Commence firing test. Frank pressed the trigger, and the M73E roared to life. The action cycled smoothly, ejecting blank casings in a steady stream. After 50 rounds, he released the trigger. Feed system functioning normally, Mitchell noted, making entries in her log. No hesitation or binding in the action. They proceeded to more challenging tests, deliberate introduction of dust, firing at extreme elevations, and finally the critical barrel change procedure. Frank, operating in a mock-up of a tank gunner's position, executed the barrel change in just 32 seconds with the enhanced locking mechanism. That's nearly 3 times faster than the M85 in the same conditions, Sullivan observed, clearly impressed. Mitchell was checking temperature readings on the barrel assembly. Heat dispersion is excellent. The modified shroud is working as designed. Frank was about to suggest they proceed to live fire testing when Sullivan hissed a warning. Vehicle approaching. Lights off. They quickly doused the work lights, leaving only the dim red safety lighting. Through the darkness, they could see headlights approaching the range entrance. Security patrol, Mitchell whispered. Sullivan shook his head. Wrong direction. They always come from the main gate. Frank made a quick decision. Disassemble the prototype. Pack everything. Sullivan, delay whoever that is. As Mitchell and Frank hurriedly broke down the M73E, Sullivan moved toward the entrance. Through the open door, Frank could see a sedan pull up and a figure emerge. Even in the dim light, Dr. Westmore's silhouette was unmistakable. Sullivan intercepted him at the gate. Good evening, Doctor. Can I help you? Lieutenant Sullivan, Westmore's surprise was evident in his voice. What are you doing here at this hour? Historical research, sir. I'm documenting the firing ranges for a monograph on Aberdeen's development. Frank could hear the skepticism in Westmore's reply. At night? Best time to take atmospheric readings without interference from daytime testing, Sullivan improvised smoothly. The historical records indicate significant variances in test results based on humidity and temperature. While this exchange continued, Frank and Mitchell worked frantically to conceal all evidence of their prototype. Just as they secured the last component, they heard footsteps approaching. "I'm sorry, Doctor, but this area is restricted after hours," Sullivan was saying as he escorted Westmore toward the building. "I have full clearance for all testing facilities," Westmore insisted, then stopped short when he saw Frank and Mitchell. "Lieutenant Townsend, Dr. Mitchell, what an unexpected gathering." Frank stepped forward casually. "Dr. Westmore, we were just reviewing some historical test data Lieutenant Sullivan uncovered. Interesting parallels to our current challenges." Westmore's eyes narrowed suspiciously as he surveyed the room. "Historical data that requires hands-on examination at an active test range after hours? The best insights often come from unexpected sources and times," Frank replied evenly. Westmore's attention fixed on a partially visible equipment case. "What's in there?" Before Frank could respond, Mitchell intervened. "Components for tomorrow's environmental testing of the M85, Doctor. I was preparing them for early setup." Westmore didn't appear convinced, but seemed unable to find concrete evidence of wrongdoing. "I see. Well, I'll expect a full report on these historical insights tomorrow morning, Lieutenant." "Of course, Doctor," Frank agreed. After Westmore departed, the three exchanged grim looks. "He suspects something," Sullivan said unnecessarily. "We're out of time," Frank decided. "The prototype performed well enough in preliminary testing. We need to present it to Hamilton immediately before Westmore can interfere further." Mitchell looked uncertain. "Without complete testing data? That's not standard procedure." "Nothing about this situation is standard," Frank replied. "The M85 is going to be approved for political reasons despite its flaws unless we provide a viable alternative immediately." After a moment's hesitation, Mitchell nodded. "You're right, the prototype is ready. Not perfect, but functional and demonstrably superior to both the M73 and M85 for tank use." "Then we move tomorrow," Frank declared. "First thing in the morning, we request a private demonstration for General Hamilton." As they secured their equipment and prepared to depart separately to avoid suspicion, Frank felt the familiar tension that preceded combat. This wasn't a battle with bullets and shells, but the stakes were just as high. Lives would depend on the outcome, even if those lives belonged to soldiers not yet born, fighting in wars not yet imagined. Sullivan paused at the door, glancing back at Frank with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Lieutenant, the Germans had a saying during the war, 'Das Beste ist der Feind des Guten.' The best is the enemy of the good," Frank translated. Sullivan nodded. "Sometimes pursuing theoretical perfection prevents achieving practical success. The Germans learned that lesson too late with their wonder weapons. Let's hope we don't make the same mistake." As Frank drove back to his quarters through the quiet Maryland night, he reflected on the path that had brought him here. When he'd received orders to Aberdeen, he had resented being pulled from his command, from the men he'd trained to fight alongside. Now he understood that this was where he needed to be, fighting a different kind of battle, but one no less important. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Westmore would undoubtedly try to block their demonstration. Political pressure would continue to mount. Careers and reputations hung in the balance. But for Frank Townsend, the equation remained simple. Would the weapon function when American lives depended on it? The answer to that question was worth any professional risk. As he prepared for bed, Frank thought again of his former crew, now deployed without him. Whatever happened tomorrow, he would ensure they and countless others would have equipment worthy of their courage when the moment of truth arrived. Early the next morning, Frank arrived at Colonel Whitfield's office to request an urgent meeting with General Hamilton. To his surprise, the colonel was already waiting for him, his expression grave. "Lieutenant, I was about to send for you. There's been a development." Frank felt a sinking sensation. "Dr. Westmore?" "He filed a formal complaint this morning alleging unauthorized weapons development and misuse of government facilities. He's demanding an immediate investigation and your removal from the testing program." "Sir, we have a working prototype that addresses all the M85's flaws while maintaining its advantages. We need to demonstrate it to General Hamilton before Westmore can bury it." Whitfield held up a hand. "I'm aware, Lieutenant. The General wants to see you immediately." Minutes later, Frank stood at attention in Hamilton's office. The General's expression was unreadable as he gestured for Frank to sit. Lieutenant, I have a formal complaint on my desk accusing you of conducting unauthorized weapons development, misappropriating government resources, and insubordination. Serious charges. Yes, sir. Do you deny them? Frank met the general's gaze directly. No, sir, but I would ask for the opportunity to demonstrate why those actions were necessary before any disciplinary proceedings begin. A hint of a smile crossed Hamilton's weathered face. I thought as much. Colonel Whitfield has already briefed me on your unofficial project. I'm interested in seeing this alternative design. Frank's surprise must have shown on his face because Hamilton continued. Did you think Whitfield wasn't keeping me informed, Lieutenant? We've been around this block before. Sometimes innovation requires bending the rules, especially when political considerations threaten to override military necessity. Relief washed over Frank. Thank you, sir. The prototype is ready for demonstration. Dr. Mitchell and Lieutenant Sullivan assisted in its development. I've already instructed Whitfield to arrange a secure demonstration for 0900 hours. Westmore won't be informed until it's underway. Hamilton leaned forward, his expression turning serious. But understand this, Lieutenant. If your alternative doesn't perform as promised, I won't be able to protect you from the consequences of your actions. Understood, sir. It will perform. At precisely 0900, a small group gathered at the secure test range. General Hamilton and Colonel Whitfield represented the command structure. Dr. Mitchell had brought the reassembled M73E prototype, while Sullivan provided historical context materials to explain the design lineage. Frank had just begun to explain the conceptual approach when the door burst open. Dr. Westmore stormed in, followed by the silver-haired executive from Precision Defense Systems, and most concerning, a stern-looking brigadier general Frank didn't recognize. General Hamilton, the brigadier began without preamble. I'm General Lawrence from the Pentagon's Acquisition Office. I understand you're conducting an unauthorized demonstration of a non-approved weapon system. Hamilton didn't appear intimidated. Brigadier General Lawrence, I don't recall inviting you to Aberdeen today. Senator Hayes requested my presence to ensure proper acquisition protocols are being followed. Lawrence replied stiffly. Dr. Westmore informs me that Lieutenant Townsend has been developing an unauthorized alternative to the M85 program. That's correct, Hamilton acknowledged calmly. And as the commanding officer of this facility, I authorized this demonstration. This caught Lawrence off guard. You authorized it? Without notifying the acquisition office or the prime contractor? I authorized Lieutenant Townsend to explore alternatives after extensive testing revealed critical flaws in the M85 design, Hamilton clarified. A commander's prerogative when evaluating equipment that may affect the lives of his soldiers. Westmore stepped forward, barely containing his anger. This is an outrageous breach of contract and protocol. Precision Defense Systems has exclusive development rights for the next-generation tank machine gun under the current procurement agreement. Hamilton's voice remained level, but took on a dangerous edge. That agreement assumes the delivered system meets the Army's operational requirements, Doctor. Your M85 has consistently failed to do so under realistic combat conditions. The PDS executive intervened smoothly. General Hamilton, we understand there have been some testing discrepancies, but surely these can be resolved through the established change management process, not through unauthorized parallel development. Gentlemen, Hamilton replied, I suggest we proceed with the demonstration. Then we can discuss procurement protocols with a complete understanding of the alternatives. General Lawrence looked as though he might object, but Hamilton's tone and the silver stars on his shoulders carried significant weight. Very well, but I must insist this demonstration be fully documented for review by the Acquisition Committee. Of course, Hamilton agreed readily. Lieutenant Townsend, please proceed. Frank stepped forward, conscious of the heightened stakes. What had been a clandestine project developed in spare moments was now center stage in a high-level military procurement battle. But as he began to explain the M73E concept, his confidence grew. The design was sound. The principles were proven. Most importantly, it would work when soldiers needed it. The M73E represents a practical evolution rather than a theoretical revolution, Frank explained. We've maintained the proven rotating barrel change system of the M73, which functions effectively in the confined space of a tank turret, while incorporating simplified internal mechanisms inspired by the German MG42 and modern engineering principles provided by Dr. Mitchell. Mitchell took over the technical explanation, detailing the innovations in the feed system, the improved barrel locking mechanism, and the enhanced heat dispersion design. Sullivan then provided historical context, explaining how the German military had faced and solved similar challenges during World War II. Throughout the presentation, Westmore's expression grew increasingly thunderous, while the PDS executive looked progressively more concerned. General Lawrence remained impassive, though Frank thought he detected growing interest behind the man's professional mask. The proof, of course, is in the performance, Frank concluded. With your permission, General, we'd like to demonstrate the M73E under the same conditions that caused the M85 to fail. Hamilton nodded. Proceed. They moved to the test area where Mitchell had prepared both the M73E prototype and a standard M85 for comparison testing. The first test was basic functionality, with both weapons performing admirably. Then came the environmental challenges: dust, mud, extended firing without maintenance. While the M85 began experiencing stoppages and failures, the M73E continued to function reliably. The decisive demonstration came with the barrel change procedure. Frank asked a regular tank gunner, who had never seen either weapon before, to perform barrel changes on both systems while seated in an actual tank turret. The results were dramatic. The gunner struggled for over 3 minutes with the M85 before successfully changing the barrel, while completing the same procedure on the M73E in just 38 seconds. When the demonstrations concluded, even General Lawrence appeared impressed. The performance difference is significant, he acknowledged. Westmore was frantically reviewing the test data. This is absurd. The M73E's theoretical performance metrics are inferior to the M85 in multiple categories. On paper, yes, Frank agreed. The M73E has a slightly lower cyclic rate and marginally reduced effective range, but it functions reliably under all conditions, and the barrel can be changed quickly in the confined space of a tank turret. In combat, those advantages far outweigh theoretical performance metrics. The PDS executive had been in hushed conversation with General Lawrence and now stepped forward with a new approach. General Hamilton, while this demonstration is certainly impressive, the M73E lacks the extensive development and testing history of the M85. Perhaps the most prudent approach would be to continue M85 development while exploring the possibility of incorporating some of these innovations in future variants. It was a clever political compromise, one that would preserve the M85 program and PDS's contract while appearing responsive to the concerns raised. Frank held his breath as Hamilton considered the suggestion. An interesting proposal, Hamilton replied thoughtfully. Lieutenant Townsend, your assessment? Frank chose his words carefully, aware of the career implications but unwilling to compromise on the fundamental issue. Sir, the M85's flaws are not peripheral but central to its design architecture. The side ejection barrel change system is fundamentally incompatible with tank use. No amount of modification will resolve that core issue without essentially creating a new weapon. I concur, Mitchell added, surprising everyone with her willingness to publicly oppose her superior. The M73E represents a more practical approach that prioritizes reliability and usability in actual combat conditions. Hamilton turned to General Lawrence. The testimony of the technical experts seems clear. The M85 concept is fundamentally flawed for tank application, while the M73E offers a practical alternative that can be developed quickly and at lower cost. Lawrence looked uncomfortable but nodded slowly. I'll need to bring this information back to the Acquisition Committee for review. Senator Hayes will have questions. I'm sure he will, Hamilton replied dryly. Please inform the senator that I'm available to discuss the matter personally at his convenience. As the group dispersed, Frank could see Westmore in heated conversation with the PDS executive. The battle wasn't over. But they had won an important skirmish. The M73E had demonstrated its superiority in the only metrics that truly mattered: reliability and usability in combat conditions. Colonel Whitfield approached Frank with a slight smile. Well done, Lieutenant. Though I suspect your immediate career prospects within the Acquisition Corps may be somewhat limited after today. Frank returned the smile. I can live with that, sir. I never planned on a career in weapons development anyway. No, Whitfield agreed. Your place is with your men. Speaking of which, I received word this morning your former platoon has been involved in heavy action near the border. They've acquitted themselves well. Frank felt a complex mix of pride and regret. Pride in his men's performance. Regret that he hadn't been there to lead them. Any casualties, sir? None from your old crew, Whitfield assured him. In fact, Sergeant Thompson was mentioned by name in the after-action report for extraordinary action under fire. Relief washed over Frank. His men were still alive, still fighting. And now, perhaps, his work here would help ensure they and countless others would have equipment worthy of their courage when the moment of truth arrived. As he walked back to the administrative building with Mitchell and Sullivan, Frank felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended the day's events. They had not merely developed a better weapon, but had stood firm against the bureaucratic and political pressures that too often prioritize contracts over combat effectiveness. "What happens now?" Sullivan asked. "Westmore won't give up easily, and he has powerful allies." "Now we document everything," Frank replied. "Every test, every result, every design decision. Make it impossible for them to ignore the evidence." Mitchell nodded in agreement. "I'll begin compiling the technical documentation immediately. And Lieutenant, thank you for standing firm. It would have been easier to compromise." "Easy doesn't win wars, Doctor," Frank replied, thinking of his men far away. "And it doesn't save lives. We do what's necessary, whatever the cost." As they parted ways, Frank glanced back at the test range where their prototype had performed so admirably. The M73E wasn't perfect. No weapon ever was. But it would function when needed most, when young men and steel monsters faced the chaos and terror of combat. For Frank Townsend, that was victory enough for one day. The battle for the soul of the weapon system had been joined. The outcome remained uncertain, with political forces arrayed against their practical approach. But they had demonstrated the truth, and in the end, Frank believed that truth would prevail. Not because the world was fair, or because good always triumphed, but because somewhere, somewhen, American lives would depend on the choices made in these quiet testing grounds, far from the sound of battle. And on that day, those lives would matter more than politics, contracts, or careers. Frank straightened his shoulders and walked on, ready for whatever came next. The day's victory was just one engagement in a longer campaign. The war to ensure America's soldiers had equipment worthy of their courage continued, and he would fight it to the end. 3 weeks after the demonstration of the M73E prototype, Frank Townsend stood at the window of his temporary quarters at Aberdeen, watching rain streak down the glass. The Maryland spring had turned wet and gloomy, matching the uncertain atmosphere that had settled over the testing facility. Since the dramatic showdown with Westmore and General Lawrence, a strange limbo had descended on the machine gun program. The official word was that both systems, the M85 and the M73E, were under evaluation. In reality, a quiet battle raged in Washington between competing interests: military necessity versus political expedience, practical functionality versus theoretical performance, jobs in Senator Hayes's district versus the lives of future tank crews. A knock at the door interrupted Frank's thoughts. Lieutenant Sullivan entered, rainwater dripping from his cover. "News, sir," Sullivan reported, his expression carefully neutral. "General Hamilton has called an emergency meeting of the Evaluation Committee for 0900 tomorrow. All principals are ordered to attend." "Both sides?" "Yes, sir. Westmore, Mitchell, the PDS executives, General Lawrence, everyone." Frank considered this development. "Any indication which way the decision is leaning?" "Nothing definitive, but there's a rumor that Senator Hayes had a private meeting with the Secretary of Defense yesterday." "Political pressure, as expected." Frank nodded, unsurprised. "We knew this would happen. We've done all we can to demonstrate the truth. Now it's up to the system to decide whether truth matters more than politics." "You think we'll lose?" Sullivan observed. Frank turned from the window. "I think the system often chooses the politically expedient path over the right one. But General Hamilton hasn't let us down yet." After Sullivan departed, Frank reviewed the extensive documentation they had compiled over the past weeks. Mitchell had produced detailed technical analyses proving the superiority of the M73E in combat conditions. Sullivan had assembled historical precedents from World War II through Vietnam, showing how theoretical performance metrics often failed to translate to battlefield effectiveness. Frank himself had written a comprehensive report on the practical implications for tank crews. Their case was ironclad from a military perspective. But would that be enough to overcome the political and economic factors aligned against them? Frank's thoughts were interrupted by another knock. This time it was Colonel Whitfield, his expression grave. "Lieutenant, we have a situation," Whitfield began without preamble. "Dr. Mitchell was just escorted off the base by security. Westmore is accusing her of stealing proprietary design information." Frank felt a surge of anger. "That's absurd. The M73E uses entirely different operating principles." Nevertheless, she's been suspended pending investigation, and there's more. Someone broke into the secure storage facility last night. The M73E prototype is missing. The implications were clear. Without Mitchell or the prototype, their position at tomorrow's meeting would be severely weakened. Westmore was systematically eliminating their ability to make their case. This is a setup, Frank stated flatly. Almost certainly, Whitfield agreed. But proving it in time for tomorrow's meeting will be difficult. Westmore has covered his tracks well. Frank considered their options. What about General Hamilton? Has he been informed? He's in Washington until tomorrow morning, unreachable until the meeting. A perfect storm. With Hamilton absent, Mitchell suspended, and their prototype missing, the opposition had effectively neutralized their position. Whoever had planned this had timed it perfectly. Sir, I need to speak with Mitchell, Frank decided. Where was she taken? She's not under arrest, just escorted off federal property. Probably at her apartment in Aberdeen town. Frank nodded. And Sullivan, is he still in the clear? For now, but I'd advise caution. Westmore seems determined to discredit everyone associated with the M73E project. After Whitfield left, Frank changed into civilian clothes. If Westmore had people watching, he wouldn't make it easy for them to track his movements. A storm was gathering, both literally and figuratively, and he needed to move quickly to salvage what they had worked for. The town of Aberdeen huddled beneath sheets of spring rain as Frank drove through in his personal vehicle, an aging Chevrolet that had seen him through 2 tours in Germany. Mitchell lived in a modest apartment complex on the edge of town, popular with civilian contractors who worked at the proving ground. He found her apartment and knocked, unsure of his reception. After a moment, the door opened a crack, then wider as she recognized him. "Lieutenant Townsend," she said, her voice tight with strain. "You shouldn't be here. They're probably watching." "Let them watch," Frank replied, stepping inside as she moved back. "We need to talk." Mitchell's apartment was sparsely furnished but meticulously organized, much like the woman herself. Papers and technical journals were stacked neatly on a small dining table that appeared to serve as both eating space and work desk. A half-empty cup of coffee sat cooling beside an open notebook filled with equations. "They took everything," she said without preamble. "My research, my notes on the M73E, even my personal journals. Security arrived at my office with Westmore and that PDS executive. They claimed I'd stolen proprietary technology and copied classified documents without authorization." "Did they present any evidence?" Frank asked. "They didn't need to. In these situations, the accusation is enough to trigger an investigation and suspension. By the time I'm cleared, if I'm cleared, the decision on the machine gun program will be long made." Frank nodded grimly. "The prototype is missing too, taken from secure storage overnight." Mitchell's eyes widened. That's not coincidence. No, Westmore is eliminating all evidence that contradicts his narrative before tomorrow's meeting. She sank into a chair, the weight of the situation settling visibly on her shoulders. "Then it's over. Without the prototype or the technical documentation, we can't make our case." Frank remained standing, unwilling to accept defeat. "Not necessarily. Sullivan still has the historical documentation. I have my personal notes and observations, and there's something Westmore doesn't know about." "What's that?" "I sent a complete technical package on the M73E to my old tank commander, Sergeant Thompson, currently deployed overseas. I wanted his practical assessment from a combat perspective. That file contains detailed schematics and operating principles. Westmore can't reach it." Hope flickered in Mitchell's eyes. "But how does that help us tomorrow? Thompson is halfway around the world." "He sent his assessment back by military mail last week. It should have arrived at Aberdeen by now, addressed to me personally." Mitchell leaned forward. "So there's still a complete technical record of the M73E design. If we can get to it in time, the mailroom at Aberdeen closes at 1700 hours. Frank checked his watch. "We have less than an hour." "I can't go back on base," Mitchell reminded him. "Not without authorization." "No, but Sullivan can. I'll call him from a secure line." Using Mitchell's phone, Frank contacted Sullivan and explained the situation. The lieutenant agreed to retrieve the package immediately and meet them at a diner just outside the base perimeter. "There's still the matter of the missing prototype," Mitchell pointed out after he hung up. "Without the actual hardware to demonstrate, the documentation alone may not be enough." Frank had been considering this problem. "I think I know where to look, but it's risky. Whitfield said someone broke into the secure storage facility, but that doesn't make sense. Those facilities have guards, security cameras, access logs. You think it was an inside job? I think the prototype never left the base. Westmore would need to ensure it couldn't be found before the meeting, but he wouldn't risk taking it off federal property. That would be theft of government property, a serious crime. Mitchell followed his reasoning, so he moved it somewhere on base where we wouldn't think to look. Exactly, and there's one place that would be perfect. The scrapyard behind the ballistics testing range. Hundreds of destroyed weapon prototypes and test articles. Perfect place to hide one more. We need to search it tonight, Mitchell said firmly. Frank shook his head. Not we. You're barred from the base. Sullivan and I will handle it after we get the documentation. The diner was nearly empty when they arrived, just a few locals nursing coffee at the counter. Sullivan appeared 20 minutes later, a thick manila envelope clutched under his rain jacket. Got it, he reported, sliding into the booth across from them. Thompson's assessment and the complete M73E documentation. He was thorough. Frank opened the envelope and scanned the contents. Thompson's practical evaluation was exactly what he'd hoped for. Blunt, detailed, and overwhelmingly positive. The barrel change mechanism received particular praise, with Thompson noting it could be operated effectively even under the stress of combat. This is excellent, Frank said, but without the prototype, Westmore will claim we're presenting theoretical advantages, just as he was. Sullivan nodded. Lieutenant Townsend thinks the prototype might be hidden in the scrapyard. We need to search it tonight. That area isn't well lit or patrolled, Mitchell observed, but it's also huge, finding one machine gun among tons of destroyed equipment in the dark and rain. We have an advantage, Frank replied. We know exactly what we're looking for, and I have a pretty good idea of where Westmore would hide it, somewhere difficult to access but not impossible to find if they need to retrieve it later. As night fell, Frank and Sullivan approached the base from a rarely used access road. As officers assigned to the testing facility, they had legitimate reasons to be on base after hours, but the fewer people who saw them near the scrapyard, the better. The rain had intensified, turning the unpaved areas around the scrapyard to mud. Using flashlights sparingly to avoid drawing attention, they began their search, focusing on areas where larger items had been discarded, offering concealment for the prototype. After an hour of increasingly muddy and frustrating searching, Sullivan called out softly, "Lieutenant, over here." Frank made his way carefully through the debris to where Sullivan stood beside a derelict armored personnel carrier hull long ago gutted for parts. Inside, partially wrapped in a tarp, lay their missing prototype. Clever, Frank observed, hidden but accessible if they needed to move it again. Together they extracted the M73E from its hiding place. Despite the rain and mud, the weapon appeared undamaged, its protective Cosmoline coating having shielded it from the elements. Now what? Sullivan asked. If we take this back to secure storage, Westmore will just have it removed again before morning. Frank considered their options. We take it directly to the meeting tomorrow. Bring it right through the front door before Westmore realizes it's been found. Bold move, Sullivan commented with a hint of admiration, but effective. They carefully wrapped the prototype and loaded it into Frank's car, concealing it beneath a tarp in the trunk. The rain had soaked them both to the skin, but neither complained. Too much was at stake. After dropping Sullivan at his quarters with instructions for the morning, Frank returned to Mitchell's apartment to update her on their success. You actually found it, she marveled, examining the mud-spattered but intact prototype on her kitchen table. But where will you keep it tonight? They'll search your quarters if they realize it's missing from the scrapyard. It stays here, Frank decided. It's the last place they'd look. I'll pick it up on my way to the meeting. Mitchell nodded, then hesitated. Lieutenant Frank, thank you for not giving up. Most officers would have backed down once the political pressure started. This isn't about politics for me, he replied simply. It's about making sure the young men who will use this weapon have equipment they can depend on when their lives are on the line. Your former crew, she said, understanding. You're still fighting for them, even from here. For them and for every tank crew that will come after them. Some battles are fought with shells and armor, others with facts and persistence. But they're all worth fighting if the cause is just. Dawn broke gray and rainy over Aberdeen Proving Ground as Frank and Sullivan prepared for the decisive meeting. They had agreed to arrive separately to avoid drawing attention. Frank would collect Mitchell and the prototype on his way, while Sullivan would bring the documentation directly to the meeting room. The administration building's conference room was already filling with participants when Frank arrived. General Hamilton had returned from Washington and sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. Colonel Whitfield occupied a chair to his right, while General Lawrence sat opposite. Dr. Westmore and the PDS executives clustered at the far end, engaged in whispered conversation. Frank entered with Mitchell following, the M73E prototype carried conspicuously in his arms. The room fell silent as heads turned to stare. "Lieutenant Townsend," Westmore sputtered, his face reddening, "Dr. Mitchell is suspended and barred from this facility." General Hamilton raised an eyebrow. "I've temporarily reinstated Dr. Mitchell's access for this meeting, Doctor. I want to hear all perspectives before making my decision." "And that," Frank added, placing the prototype carefully on the conference table, "includes a full demonstration of the M73E that mysteriously disappeared from secure storage." Westmore's expression confirmed what Frank had suspected. The man had never expected them to recover the prototype. That's government property improperly removed from secure facilities," he managed finally. "Indeed it was," Frank agreed calmly. "Removed and hidden in the scrapyard behind the ballistics range. An interesting location for valuable prototype equipment, wouldn't you say, General Hamilton?" Hamilton's gaze hardened as he looked from the prototype to Westmore. "Very interesting, Lieutenant. Almost as interesting as these documents that were delivered to my quarters this morning." He placed a folder on the table. Security camera footage from the secure storage facility showing Dr. Westmore and 2 PDS employees removing the M73E prototype 2 nights ago, along with access logs confirming they had no authorization to do so. The PDS executive paled visibly. There must be some mistake. Dr. Westmore was conducting authorized inventory. At 2:30 in the morning, Hamilton interrupted, without filing access requests or notifying security. "That's not inventory, Mr. Daniels. That's tampering with evidence." General Lawrence looked deeply uncomfortable. "General Hamilton, while these allegations are concerning, they don't address the fundamental question before us today. Which weapon system best serves the needs of the United States Army?" "On the contrary," Hamilton replied, "they speak directly to that question. If the M85 is truly superior, why would its advocates need to resort to sabotage and evidence tampering to make their case?" The room fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled officials. Finally, Hamilton continued, "Nevertheless, we will proceed with our technical evaluation as planned. Lieutenant Townsend, please present your findings on the M73E system." For the next hour, Frank, Mitchell, and Sullivan presented their comprehensive assessment of both weapon systems. They methodically detailed the M85's flaws in combat conditions and demonstrated how the M73E addressed these shortcomings while maintaining compatibility with tank operations. Thompson's combat assessment proved particularly powerful, offering the perspective of an active-duty tank commander currently deployed in a combat zone. His blunt language and practical insights cut through the technical jargon, bringing the real-world implications into sharp focus. When they finished, Westmore attempted to counter with his own technical data, but his credibility had been severely damaged by the security footage. His arguments about the M85's superior theoretical performance rang hollow against the demonstrated reliability of the M73E in combat conditions. As the presentations concluded, General Hamilton surveyed the room. "I've heard enough to make my determination. The evidence clearly demonstrates that the M73E represents the superior option for tank-mounted applications. It will be recommended for further development and eventual fielding." The PDS executives exchanged alarmed glances. "General, this decision will have serious economic implications for thousands of workers in the defense industry," Daniels protested. "I'm well aware of the economic factors, Mr. Daniels," Hamilton replied firmly. "That's why my recommendation will include converting the existing M85 production facilities to manufacture the M73E instead. The jobs remain, only the product changes." It was a masterful solution, addressing the political concerns while maintaining the military imperative. Even General Lawrence appeared satisfied with the compromise. "Furthermore," Hamilton continued, "I'm recommending that Lieutenant Townsend be temporarily promoted to major and assigned to oversee the initial production and field testing of the M73E system." Frank was stunned by this unexpected development. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but my place is with my unit. My men are still deployed." Hamilton raised a hand to stop him. "Your men will be rotating back within the month, Major. By the time they deploy again, you'll have completed this assignment and can rejoin them with your new rank intact. Consider it the Army's way of acknowledging that doing the right thing, even at personal risk, deserves recognition." The meeting adjourned shortly after, with subdued PDS executives and a fuming Westmore filing out quickly. As Frank gathered the prototype and documentation, General Lawrence approached him privately. "That was well played, Townsend," Lawrence admitted. "I want you to know that my concerns were never about the technical merits. The procurement system has broader considerations than pure military functionality." "I understand that, sir," Frank replied. "But when those broader considerations potentially put American lives at risk, someone needs to speak up." Lawrence nodded thoughtfully. "There's a place for men like you in the acquisition system, Major, officers who understand both the technical and tactical sides of the equation. Consider a career track in weapons development after your command time." "Thank you, sir. I'll give it some thought." As Lawrence departed, Mitchell approached with a relieved smile. "Congratulations, Major Townsend. You've earned that promotion." "We all did," Frank corrected her. "Your engineering expertise was crucial. Without you and Sullivan, the M73E would never have existed." "Speaking of Lieutenant Sullivan," she said, glancing toward where the young officer was gathering his historical documentation, "I hear he's been offered a position with the Army Historical Division, documenting lessons learned from past weapons development programs." Frank smiled. "Good. The Army needs someone to ensure we don't keep repeating the same mistakes generation after generation." Colonel Whitfield joined them, extending his hand to Frank. "Well done, Major. You took a significant career risk standing up to Westmore and his political allies. Not many officers would have had that courage." "It wasn't courage, sir," Frank replied honestly. "Just duty. The men who will use these weapons deserve our best efforts. Politics be damned." Whitfield smiled. "That attitude might limit your promotion prospects beyond lieutenant colonel, you realize." "I can live with that, sir. I didn't join the Army to make general. I joined to make a difference." Fort Knox, Kentucky, 5 years later. Colonel Frank Townsend stood beside an M1 Abrams tank, watching as a new class of officer candidates practice barrel changes on the tank's machine gun system. The M73E, now officially designated the M240, had become standard equipment on all American tanks and was developing a reputation for exceptional reliability under combat conditions. 31 seconds, Frank noted as one candidate completed the procedure. "Not bad for your third attempt. Keep practicing." The young man nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As the training continued, Frank noticed a familiar figure approaching across the parade ground. Colonel Eleanor Mitchell, now the Army's senior small arms development engineer, wore her uniform with the same precise attention to detail that characterized her technical work. "Colonel Townsend," she greeted him with a smile. "Still terrorizing the young officers, I see." "Just ensuring they appreciate the importance of a properly executed barrel change," Frank replied. "What brings you to Knox, Colonel?" "The XM300 project. I've been asked to head the development team, and I wanted your input before we finalize the design parameters." Frank raised an eyebrow. "They're still pursuing that designation?" "After the last one ended so controversially." "Different weapon, same number," Mitchell explained. "This one's a complete redesign based on the M240's successful operating principles. We're incorporating some new materials technology, but the fundamental architecture remains true to your original concept." "Not my concept," Frank corrected her. "Ours, and ultimately based on lessons the Germans learned the hard way in World War II." They walked together toward the base headquarters, the sounds of training fading behind them. "I heard you're being considered for brigade command," Mitchell remarked. "Quite an achievement after the Aberdeen controversy." Frank shrugged. "General Hamilton made sure that standing up for the right weapon system didn't derail my career. Though I suspect I'll never see that third star my father always hoped for." "Was that ever your ambition?" "No," Frank admitted. "My ambition was always simpler, to ensure that when young Americans go into battle, they have equipment worthy of their courage and sacrifice." They paused at the edge of the parade ground, watching as a column of Abrams tanks rumbled past on a training exercise, their M240 machine guns prominently mounted beside the main guns. "You succeeded," Mitchell said quietly. "Those tanks are better fighting vehicles because of what we did at Aberdeen." Frank nodded, thinking of the reports that had filtered back from recent conflicts. The M240 had performed flawlessly under the harshest conditions, earning the trust of the men who depended on it. No higher praise existed in Frank's mind. "We succeeded," he corrected her. "Never forget that innovation isn't the work of lone geniuses, despite what the history books sometimes suggest. It's the result of teams willing to challenge conventional wisdom and fight for what they know is right, regardless of personal cost." As they continued toward headquarters, Frank reflected on the long path that had brought him here. From a young lieutenant reluctantly pulled from his combat unit to a colonel with the power to influence the next generation of weapon systems. The journey had not been without costs, both personal and professional, yet he had stayed true to the principle that mattered most: the welfare of the men and women who would use these weapons in the chaos and terror of combat. In the end, that was the legacy that mattered. Not rank or recognition, but the lives saved by equipment that functioned when needed most. It was a legacy measured not in medals or promotion certificates, but in soldiers who returned home to their families because their equipment hadn't failed them when the moment of truth arrived. Fort Benning, Georgia, 2015. The museum was quiet as Colonel Frank Iron Townsend, long since retired, completed his story to the attentive Colonel Miranda Johnson. The morning's unveiling ceremony for the XM300 had been postponed, giving them unexpected time for this impromptu history lesson. "So that's why I questioned your side ejection design," Frank concluded, gesturing to the prototype on the conference room table. "History doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Johnson was silent for a long moment, her earlier defensiveness replaced by thoughtful consideration. "The parallel is striking," she finally acknowledged. "We've been so focused on the technical advances that we overlook the fundamental ergonomic issue." "It's an easy mistake to make," Frank assured her. "Engineers naturally prioritize performance metrics because they're measurable. Combat effectiveness is harder to quantify until lives are actually on the line." "By which time it's too late," Johnson completed the thought. "Colonel Townsend, I owe you an apology for my earlier dismissal of your concerns. Would you be willing to consult on a design modification before we proceed further?" Frank smiled, sensing a genuine desire to get it right rather than mere politeness. "I'd be honored, Colonel, though I suspect your Dr. Roberts won't be pleased." "Dr. Roberts works for the Army, not the other way around," Johnson replied with newfound conviction. "And the Army's first responsibility is to its soldiers." As they walked together toward the tank display where Frank's story had begun, Johnson asked a question that had clearly been on her mind. "Sir, if I may ask, your actions at Aberdeen could have ended your career before it truly began. Yet you took that risk without hesitation. Why?" Frank paused beside the Abrams tank, placing his hand once more on its armored hull. The metal felt cool beneath his palm, solid and reassuring. "When I was a young lieutenant," he replied slowly, "my first platoon sergeant told me something I never forgot. He said, 'Lieutenant, your job isn't to win wars or earn medals. It's to bring as many of your men home as possible. Everything else, career, politics, personal ambition, is secondary to that sacred trust.'" He looked up at Johnson, seeing understanding in her eyes. "The men and women who climb into these machines place their lives in our hands, not just in the hands of their immediate commanders, but in the hands of every person who designs, tests, and approves the equipment they depend on. That's a responsibility that transcends everything else." Johnson nodded solemnly. "I understand, sir, and I promise you we'll get this right, no matter what obstacles we encounter." "I believe you will, Colonel," Frank replied, "because you understand what's truly at stake. Not contracts or careers, but the lives of America's sons and daughters. That understanding makes all the difference." As they continued their tour of the museum, Frank felt a profound sense of continuity. The weapons and vehicles changed with each generation, growing more sophisticated and lethal. But the fundamental equation remained constant. Young Americans would always be asked to place themselves in harm's way, trusting that those behind them had provided the best possible equipment for their mission. In his long career, Frank Townsend had fought many battles, from the rain-soaked training grounds of Germany to the political minefields of the Pentagon. But the most important battle, ensuring that trust was never betrayed, continued long after his own retirement. It was now being fought by a new generation of officers like Colonel Johnson, who understood that lives, not metrics, were the true measure of success. And as long as that understanding persisted, Frank knew America's warriors would never stand alone when the moment of truth arrived. They would carry with them not just the weapons and vehicles produced by American industry, but the unwavering commitment of men and women who had fought the quiet, crucial battles to ensure those tools were worthy of the courage of those who wielded them. That was a legacy worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth preserving at any cost. The legacy of the Steel Commander, passed from generation to generation, ensuring that when American tanks rolled into battle, they carried not just the nation's power, but its sacred promise: "We will not fail you when your need is greatest." For Frank Townsend, retired colonel and tank commander, no greater victory existed than the fulfillment of that promise. And in Colonel Johnson's eyes, he saw that the battle to keep it would continue long after his own war stories faded into history.